Hey everybody, and welcome to today's session. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to all the organisers behind the scene making this event possible. Today's session is going to be about Azure Bicep and Octopus Deploy. So hopefully we will cover off infrastructure as code, trying to explain a bit about that, introduce the concept of Azure Bicep to you if you haven't already met that tool. And we'll also talk about deploying Azure Bicep with Octopus Deploy, and we'll introduce Octopus Deploy to you as well if you aren't familiar with that tool. So hopefully this will be a really good session. I have got some slides to help you understand some of the technology and what I'm going to explain, and then we'll dive into lots of demos with lots of templates, live template deployment to Azure. So fingers crossed everything goes well there. But first of all, I do want to introduce myself. I love the virtual events. I love being able to attend so many events and meeting so many people, but I do miss the in-person events where we can make those connections and introduce ourselves and have some fun, and I can bring Scottish sweets and biscuits and all sorts to you. So I'm always trying to inject a bit of my personality and a bit of Scottish culture into my slide presentations. So who am I? I am Sarah Lean. I'm based in Scotland. I'm born in Scotland as well. And I've been a techie for about 17 odd years. Now, in terms of my technology background, I am an IT pro. I am a server admin. I am a sysadmin. I am a desktop engineer. I was the person that used to rack and stack servers and fight with those horrible little cage nuts in server racks and stuff. So that's definitely where I approach technology from. I don't identify as a developer, although I do spend a lot of time writing code and in Visual Studio Code these days, so maybe I am a developer after all. I am also a Microsoft MVP. I was made a Microsoft MVP this month, so fantastic. Still unsure that happened, still can't believe that it happened, but proud to be part of that program as well. As I said, I love to meet new people, and I'm definitely missing that in-person connections that we all can do. So please do reach out to me. My Twitter handle, TechieLass, is on screen, so please do reach out to me there. And you can head over to my blog to find out what I'm doing and if I'm at other events and stuff like that as well. Staying on the Scottish theme, just for one more slide, I wanted to introduce you to this picture of a Highland cow, or a Highland cow, as we can sometimes say it in Scotland. And I actually think this animal has a lot of similarities to IT engineers as well. So the Highland cow is very adaptable. It actually has two layers of coats. So it has that furry outer layer that we can see, and then one underneath it where it can actually help keep it warm in the winter and dry in the winter as well, dealing with the harsh Scottish weather. And then it also adapts and can help it cool during the summer as well, or at least what we get in terms of summer. And where I see the parallels in terms of IT engineers is we are all very adaptable, right? New technology comes along, we get thrown a new technology over the fence by our bosses or, the business, and said, please implement this and do it by Friday. Or we have the constant changing needs of our end users, or we have the constant needs to keep up with the business demands and things that they are trying to do. And we always adapt, right? IT engineers are probably one of the most adaptable job titles out there. So I just think it's pretty cool that we can have that parallel with the Highland cow. And it's a pretty cool picture to start off a presentation with as well, I think. So hopefully that's introduced you to a bit of Scottish culture if you aren't aware of it. And if you haven't already, please do come visit Scotland when you can. It is an amazing country as well. Now back to the IT side of things. When we are talking about cloud, it introduces a lot of simplicity to our environments. We can do things that we could never do on-prem, and we could never do with traditional servers or legacy servers, depending on how you want to classify them. However, when we are deploying our infrastructure to the cloud, it can get quite complex the more advanced we get to use these environments. When we start to build on services on top of each other and they have dependencies on each other, and then we may want to add on logging and monitoring and backups, it suddenly becomes quite complex to actually deploy those technologies out and deploy them in a consistent and repeatable manner. A lot of cloud providers, or all of the cloud providers, give us that graphical user interface, a portal for us to be able to interact with. But those portals are great for one-offs, maybe for testing with, maybe for quickness in terms of just trying out a new service. But again, trying to deploy multiple resources across your environments, across different environments, tests, production, etc., can be quite cumbersome. So we need to introduce a methodology of being able to do our infrastructure and deploy it in a consistent and repeatable way, and try and reduce that management overhead and the stress of whether you've ticked the right box when you're deploying in an environment or whether you've not ticked the right box, etc. And that's where infrastructure as code actually comes into play. Now, infrastructure as code, or IAC, as you'll sometimes hear it being referred to or see it being referred to in documentation, is a bunch of templates, is a bunch of code written down that actually deploys out your resources in a consistent and repeatable manner. You have those templates and you can reuse them. You can take them and share them within your team. I could use them, and then my colleague John could use them, and then Samantha could use them. And you're just having that constant repeatable manner. So if I deploy it, the other people can deploy it in the same way, and that way we're introducing consistency into our environment, and meaning that if we want monitoring turned on for all of our servers, if you want backup it turned on for all of our servers, that will be in that infrastructure as code template. And then when everybody uses that template, they will have that consistent manner as well. So you're starting to introduce the concept of having governance and having a consistent manner inside your infrastructure, and hopefully a lot quicker as well. Now, in terms of infrastructure as code languages or tool sets, there are a lot out there. Now, on my slide, it's building out some of the logos that you may be familiar with, and some of the names like Terraform and AWS CloudFormation, Puppet, even Chef, Ansible, Azure Bicep are all in that list. Now, it's not a comprehensive list, it's just some of the big ones that I am aware of, and there's probably a ton more that I haven't even included in here. It can be quite daunting when you are trying to look at infrastructure as code and introduce it into your environment. Which one do you pick, and which one is the right tool for your organization? And I always say to customers, what you should look at is what you need from an infrastructure as code tool. What do you need it to be able to do? And then try and find the tool that matches what you need, rather than pick a shiny looking logo or pick something that you saw at a conference or even heard someone talk about. Pick the one that suits your organization, because everyone's going to have different needs and every tool offers something different. So make sure you are thinking about what you need from a tool before picking it. However, that being said, today we're going to be focusing on Azure Bicep, and for those that are maybe not aware of what Azure Bicep is, I want to cover off just some of the basics of what Azure Bicep is. And it might be the right tool for your organisation, it might not be the right tool for your organisation, but hopefully today's talk will give you some insight into what some of the potential that Azure Bicep has for you. Now, Azure Bicep is a tool that has been made by Microsoft. It is 100% free and it is open source. And I think this is one of the key things that people need to remember. Although Microsoft make it, it is open source, so you can contribute to the code, the source code, and make it a better tool, suggest ideas and interact with the product team to make this tool what you need it to be and add on all of those features. So that's something to bear in mind with as well. Now, what Azure Bicep does is build upon that Azure resource management template language that we are familiar with in the form of Azure ARM templates. Now, love or hate Azure ARM templates, they have been around for a while. And yes, I am one of those people that uses them, but consistently shouts at the screen when I forget to put the right curly bracket or comma or indentation in my templates and it doesn't work. What Azure Bicep is trying to do is take those concepts that we've learned from Azure ARM templates and then build upon them and make them easier to actually deploy and actually easier to learn from scratch. And what we'll be showing you later on in the demo is that you can use maybe 20 lines of code to deploy a resource in Azure, whereas with an Azure ARM template, you are using maybe 50 or 60 lines of code. So we're trying to, with Azure Bicep, simplify it down and make it a lot easier for you to actually use and think about and implement in your environment. Now, in terms of some of the other benefits we have with Azure Bicep, we have some great tooling in order to make it a first-class experience for you. So using Visual Studio Code and that have been used, you can actually make it a lot easier. And we'll hopefully see some of that rich infrastructure that has been brought in by the extensions within Visual Studio Code to try and help you start with those templates. You don't necessarily have to spend days and days looking at documentation. You can actually use some of the tooling and the IntelliSense that's built into Visual Studio Code to help you with that as well. It's also very modular in terms of what you can do with the code. So you can start to build up your knowledge, your repertoire of Bicep templates, and then reuse them across other infrastructure as code deployments as well. I know we probably could do that with, say, Azure ARM templates, but often I try to reuse bits of code and would find that I had forgotten a bunch of curly brackets and I've forgotten a section, and it just didn't work. It wasn't quite as easy to actually take those bits of code that you'd written in one template and reuse them across other templates. So that's some of the things that Azure Bicep is introducing. But it's not something that if you've been using Azure ARM templates and you want to start using Bicep, you don't have to necessarily start from scratch. What you can do is take the Azure ARM template and convert it into Bicep. There is a method that you can use, a command line that you can use to convert ARM templates into Bicep templates, and vice versa as well. You can create Bicep into ARM. So if you have already been using Azure ARM, then you can still use that knowledge and carry it across into using Azure Bicep as well. The deploying infrastructure as code is all very well, and we'll be showing you demos today about how to do it from your local machine and do that locally if you want. But when we start to look at organizations and we start to do the deployments at scale, what we want to try and do is actually look at automating that and making it more consistent and just bringing it bigger into the ecosystem of potentially DevOps if you're using that. Hopefully most people are using DevOps methodologies or something similar within their environment, and they're getting to that enterprise level of deploying things. And this is where Octopus Deploy can actually be introduced and help you on the next stage of that infrastructure as code journey. Now, many of you may already know what Octopus Deploy is, but I want to make sure that those that don't do have a good understanding of Octopus Deploy. Now, in its most simplified way, Octopus Deploy is a DevOps automation tool. We can help you with the deployment part of your pipeline. If that's CI/CD pipeline, we can help you with that second part, that CD part of it. We can help you deploy your software out. We can help you deploy your infrastructure as code out from a single place. Now, I've been with Octopus Deploy for 6 months now, and when I joined the team, I had pretty much zero experience of using Octopus Deploy, and I fell in love with the software, to be quite honest. It's really easy to get started with, and I've learned a ton being able to do this. And I'll hopefully show you a bit of that and show you how easy it is to get started with Octopus Deploy and using it as a tool set in your environment. In terms of what we support, in terms of where you are in your journey, if you are using Windows servers or Linux servers, we can support them. If you're running in AWS, if you're running in Azure, GCP, if you're still running your old data center, we can support all of that. We can even support cloud native deployments as well. So we have the support from those legacy to that modern infrastructure that you may be using. We also can partner with a lot of the major CI or build servers that you might be using. So you might have GitHub Actions in your environment, or you might have Azure DevOps in your environment. We can plug in to that tool and help make that CI/CD pipeline complete and really turbocharge some of the things that you're doing with your CI server already. So there's lots of integration and lots of partnerships there to bring Octopus into your tool set for your environment. Now, there are tons of features inside Octopus Deploy, and I could be here for 45 minutes or even longer talking about Octopus Deploy alone. However, what I want to cover off today and what we'll be demoing is the Runbook section within Octopus Deploy. Now, this section is kind of aimed towards the operations team, looking at maybe automating routine maintenance, emergency operations or incident responses, or even your infrastructure as code deployments. And we'll be showing you how to use that. So the Runbook section is awesome to be able to do some deployments, maybe fix some issues. So you've got a dodgy server that often needs a service restarted at 3 AM in the morning. You can automate that through Runbooks and have it triggered through Runbooks as well. So you don't have to get out your bed and answer that call. You can have it all being automated as well. Now, what I've been doing is I've talked quite a bit, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to cover off some of the demos, and I want to show you some Bicep templates and Octopus Deploy in action. So let's switch over into my Visual Studio Code environment, and we'll start looking at the Azure Bicep templates. Now here I have a fairly standard, fairly simple, fairly easy to read, hopefully, Azure Bicep template. Now, this Azure Bicep template will help you deploy an Azure Storage account. If you've ever deployed an Azure Storage account, you'll know that it's probably one of the easiest and quickest deployments you could probably do inside Azure. Through the portal, you can do that really quickly and have that storage account spun up for you quite quickly. And we're using this as an example because I think we can all relate to what a storage account is, and we can get some idea of how to build your Azure Bicep template. Now, starting off, we have at the top of our Bicep template, we have parameters or inputs that you need to be able to specify or input into your template for the template to deploy that resource for you. So the first parameter we have is the Azure Storage account type. Now, we've specified a default input here, so it's standard LRS. And again, if you've ever deployed an Azure Storage account, you'll know that you'll get options such as standard LRS or premium LRS or standard GA ZRS. I think some of the weird and wacky acronyms for the storage account. We're specifying standard LRS here for that template, and that will hopefully deploy or should deploy that for us. Our second input is around the location of where the resource, where that storage account will be deployed. What we've set here is that we're going to deploy the resource in the same location as our resource group. So I think our resource group is in North Europe, so the storage account will go into North Europe as well. Obviously, you could specify a different location here, but we're trying to keep it consistent and have our storage account in the same place as our resource group as well. Now, the third input or parameter is the actual storage account name. Now, we have no default input for this, so we will need to make sure when we deploy this template, we include what the name of the storage account should be, or it won't actually deploy for us. Now, your storage account, again, if you've deployed a storage account, you'll know it has to all be lowercase and it has to be in a certain format, so that's one to watch. But those are the basic three bits of information that we need to tell the Azure Bicep template so that it can deploy the resource. And then this next section of the template, this resource section here, is about telling the Azure ARM resource manager to actually deploy this resource. We're specifying that we want a storage account, and we're saying that we are going to give you the name, the location, and the SKU or the account type for that storage account. Now, that's the basics that you need to deploy a storage account. You could get quite complex. You could go into a lot more detail around what you wanted in terms of encryption, in terms of TLS versions you want, etc. You can have lots more information, but we're keeping it simple to start off the concept of Azure Bicep templates. Now, the last bit is an example of being able to pull out information from this deployment. We're pushing information into the template, but we might want some information out after we deploy the resource. This, I have asked for the storage account name and the actual ID number or identification of the storage account. Now, you could ask for a lot of information here if you wanted it, and it will depend on what you need from that template. And I'll show you once we deploy it what you get back. You may want to, when you get to more complex and advanced deployments, be able to take the output from one Bicep template and pass it into another, again, for more complexity, to add in how you want to manage things and how all your resources are interconnected. But we're just wanting to deploy a standard Azure storage account and have that set up there. So what I have over here is a command that will take my Bicep file and actually convert it into an ARM template. So this is to show you just the complexity that ARM templates look like if you've never seen one, and just compare the two side by side. So the AZ Bicep build will convert my Bicep template into an ARM template for me. So here we have it here. So if we open this to the side and open our Bicep template, So on the left-hand side, you have the arm template, and on the right, you have our bicep template. Now you can see my bicep template is 21 lines of code long. It's not long at all, very easy to see, very easy to understand, and instantly get an idea of what's going on. On your left-hand side here, we have this arm template. Now, if we scroll down, we have 56 lines of code. So you can easily see that the claim that the Azure Bicep team say, where they say Bicep is easier to read and much simpler to actually write and implement, is true, because it's almost double the amount of code for an ARM template when you look at that. And that's a lot more complicated, I think, to try and understand what's going on. You can, once you get into the methodology of reading these ARM templates, understand them. But yeah, I think I prefer Bicep templates. I don't know about you. So let's close that off. So what we want to do is actually deploy this Bicep template. So what I have here is a PowerShell script, and it's using new AZ resource group deployment. It will then specify a name for that deployment. It will specify the resource group we want to put this new storage account or the resources from the template in. We then declare the template file that we're wanting to deploy. And last but not least, we're deploying, we're specifying the name of the storage account. So we're using the parameter storage account name, which we saw in the template, and declaring we want to call it Sarah Storage Demo. So if I select that and run that command, it should spin off and do that deployment for us. If we switch over to my Azure portal, let's see if it's actually working. It can take a few minutes for it to actually kick in. Let's see. This is the joy of doing live demos. What I want to do while we're waiting on this to deploy is remind you that you should have access to a Slido where you can ask questions. So please do pop in your questions. I will grab them at the end of the session and answer your questions. So take advantage of Slido and make sure that you're asking any questions along the way, and we'll get to them at the end. So here we are. It has actually deployed our storage account out for us. And if we have a look at the output, so there's a lot of information that the PowerShell gives us back in terms of that. So we've got the deployment name, which we specified. We've got the resource group. We've got whether it was successful or not. Thankfully, it was successful. And we've got those outputs that we asked for. So we have the storage account name, which we knew because we specified it, but we have that long ID as well. So we have all of that information if we wanted to use it, if we needed it for something. Again, you can specify pretty much anything in terms of output, and then you can use that in other templates as well. Now, building on our Bicep knowledge, we're going to take another template here, again, for a storage account inside Azure. But this time we're building it up and again, trying to put in some best practices in terms of what we want this template to do. Now, again, at the start, we have our inputs, we have our parameters. Again, we have that storage account type 1, and we're still specifying that the default version, if the template isn't specified to do something else, we'll use the standard LRS option. However, we have specified allowed inputs. So I think we've got 8 or 9 different inputs there, and those are the types of storage account you can actually deploy inside Azure. You could specify less than this amount if you have a business requirement where you don't want to deploy premium Azure storage accounts for whatever reason. You could take that out and try and stop people from being able to deploy them or deter them from deploying them. It's a place where you can start, like I said, to introduce governance and think about best practices inside your template. So we only have certain values that can be put into this parameter, otherwise the template will fail. Again, the location, we're going to use the resource group location. This time for the storage account name, we're actually going to try and generate a unique string and try and use the template to decide what the name will be, unless, again, we specify that additionally. We're also introducing some tags. I am a big fan of tagging your Azure resources. Here at Octopus Deploy, we have a lot of rules where if your resources aren't tagged, then they will get deleted automatically. Only ones that have tags will stay. So you've got to get into good best practices, and you can build that into your template as well. So be mindful of that and start to build in these kinds of things inside your templates as well, and get into that habit of best practices. Now, again, we have this resource section, which is taking all of our inputs and trying to build them up. And we can have, you know, we've got the name, we've got the location, we've got the tags this time, we've got the SKU type. If we wanted to add in additional things inside the properties and maybe put in, say, encryption, if we started to type encryption, what the Azure Bicep extension inside Visual Studio Code is it'll start to actually tell us what options we could write. So we could have encryption enabled for the blob part of Azure Storage, and we can start to build on all of that. So you can see that using Visual Studio Code and the Bicep tooling inside of that can actually help you avoid reading all of the documentation. Not completely avoid using all of the documentation, but again, it will just help you get into best practices and help you understand the syntax of what you need to add. Now, we're not going to add that. We're just going to keep this template similar, or simple, sorry. And again, we've got our outputs here. So if we head on over to my command lines where I've brought it up already, we've got a PowerShell command here to deploy that second template. Now this time we are going to actually specify the storage account type. Now, eagle-eyed among you will notice that I've spelt standard wrong and I've got a wrong kind of storage account. That doesn't exist. That standard spelt wrongly and local does not exist. And it's not in our allowed list either for this template. So it should not run. It should fail. So if we run this command, let's make sure that my logic is correct. So again, folks, remember and hit me up with any questions and we'll get to them at the end. And there we go, that deployment has actually failed. And if we have a read of the error message, it's saying that the template couldn't be validated because the parameter values do not match the allowed values. And it's even giving us that list of allowed values. So if I was deploying this, I would now go, oh, maybe I've spelt something wrong, or maybe I've put in the wrong allowed list. So again, it's giving you that information back. So having those allowed lists can really help try and build in that governance, build in error checking as well, so you can save and understand what's going wrong potentially with your template deployments as well. So there's lots of things you can do, and that's one of the things that you can do within Bicep templates. Now, it's all very well us sitting here with the templates on my laptop, on my local Visual Studio Code instance, and deploying them here. And because I'm just deploying one storage account, it's fairly easy and fairly simple to do that. However, if we're starting to actually do this in an environment, in a production environment, in a test environment, we want to start to be able to scale this, and we want to take the management overhead away from myself. So I don't want to be the only person in the team that can actually deploy our infrastructure, because what happens when I have a day off or I'm sick or whatever, the whole business might grind to a halt, which isn't ideal. So this is where I want to introduce the concept of using Octopus Deploy to try and automate these templates for you. So now, the first thing we have to do for these templates to be deployable by Octopus is actually put them into a zip file. So unfortunately, at the moment, the Octopus tool can't store .bicep files inside its internal library, but we can store zip files. So what we're going to do is zip up our templates into a zip file and then upload them into my Octopus server so that I can jump over there and show you how to deploy your Bicep templates inside Octopus. So let me grab my pre-made code. And what you'll see, hopefully, is, yes, it's creating that zip file for me. So it's created my storage template into a zip file, and then it's successfully pushed that into my Octopus environment. So if we switch over to my Octopus environment, this is what Octopus looks like for anybody that hasn't used it before. So you get the menu system on the top along the top bar for you, and you can interact with it various different points here. And then you have this help menu here that can pop out and help you with queries. If you're not sure how to use something, it will give you a lot of help information, or it'll point you towards some resources where you can find out more information. So there's lots of information here within Octopus to get started. And like I said, I started 6 months learning about Octopus, and it's been a great learning journey because everything is pretty much laid out where you think it should be, and it does behave like you think it should do. Now here's our library, and here is our storage template. So we have that zip file with our Azure Bicep file uploaded into our Octopus server. Now what I also have done pre-made is connected my Octopus instance with my Azure subscription. You'll see I've got a bunch of Azure subscriptions that I'm working with. So I have made that connection through an Azure service principal and inputted that information here so that our Octopus Deploy environment can create resources, can delete resources, can read resources, can do the whole shot from Octopus Deploy to our Azure environment. So we don't have to necessarily go into our Azure environment and do anything. We can automate it all from inside Octopus. So we've got our Azure connection and we've got our Bicep files uploaded into our Octopus server. What we want to do is start to build in some variables. So when we were deploying it locally from our machine, we were hard coding the input or the information in. What we want to start to do when we are doing it in an enterprise scale, when we're automating it, is build in some variables so that we can change them and so we can flip between the names of things or the types of accounts that we want. I've inputted some of my variables, but I want to show you how to create variables inside Octopus and use some of the power of them already without watching me type incorrectly live on a demo. I've already inputted variables for my Azure resource group, and what that name would appear to be was using variables inside Octopus already. So I'm saying use the space name, so that would be in our case Bicep Demo. And then it would use the environment name. So that would either be something like test or production or Q&A or dev, whatever your environment you're actually running and deploying into would be called. I've also got the location for my resources. So this time I'm using West Europe and I've got that there already. What I want to do if I'm deploying my Azure storage account is actually create a variable so that I can give the storage account a name depending on what I want it to be. So if we type in, I can't spell, Azure storage account name, what we can do is add in a name here. So if we put Sarah and then let's use the environment. So it would be Sarah and then it would probably be test if we deployed to test, and we can scope these variables. So that variable will only ever be used if we're deploying to the test environment. If we add another one and we do the exact same, and then do production, we can add on different things. So we could say demo here, or then say don't delete. Hopefully that will actually match what we need in terms of the Azure storage account naming conventions. But we can see here we've got a scoping variable that would only be used when we're deploying to our test, and one we were deploying to our production. So we'll save those variables and then we'll head on over to projects. Now I've got a couple of projects here. I've got one already for Bicep Template. So if we have a look inside here, and then we click on Runbooks. I've got a Runbook already made and to show you some of the basics of running that. In here, we have two steps. We have a step that is deploying a resource group, so making sure we have a resource group for our resources to be deployed into. And then the second step is actually taking that Bicep template and deploying out whatever resources I have built into my Azure Bicep template. So if we have a wee quick look at what these steps are doing, they're doing nothing that we haven't maybe done already on the local machine in the demo already. The first step is the resource group. So we're using a simple Azure CLI command to create that resource group. We're using the variable, the Azure location one that we saw, and then we're also using the resource group name one as well. So that step will create our resource group if it isn't already there, and then we'll use that for our Bicep template. If we scroll down to our Bicep template source code and what the step is actually doing here, we have a little bit more code in terms of what we're doing and what we were actually doing on our local Visual Studio Code. What we have here in the first line is actually telling Octopus that you have a zip file that you have to extract, and the zip file is called storagetemplate.zip. What we want to do is we want to extract that, and then what you do is change into the directory where that extracted package is. So it'll start to see those storage.bicep files that we had on our local machine. We're then creating a bit of a fancier deployment name. So we're saying storage template plus today's date. So the machine, the PowerShell will capture today's date and add it on to the deployment name. So it'll be storage template and then hopefully today's date. And then the last line here is literally that same PowerShell command that we used inside Visual Studio Code on my machine. We've just substituted some of the hard-coded information for the variables that we have inside our variable library at Octopus. So 2 steps to deploy out that template. And again, you might want to be doing more complex environments, but for this example, I'm going to hit run. I'm going to say I want to run this in my test environment and I'll click run. So what this will do is it will start to spin up our Octopus environment and tell it that it needs to issue out of some of these commands. So it needs to go and create that Azure resource group if it isn't already created, and then deploy out our template. So this usually takes about a minute or so. So let's have a look and check that it's working. So if we check our task information, we can. My machine has just stopped a second, hang on. So if we click on verbose, we can actually see some of the information, what the actual Octopus tasks are actually doing. Green is a good sign, so it's showing us that it's created that resource group, or that resource group is already there. So we should have a resource group called Bicep Demo /test/RG, inside our Azure environment. So now Octopus is away getting that zip file and unpacking that and getting that ready for use for deployment out. So if we have a look at our Azure environment while we're waiting, we've got the resource group here, and if we refresh it, that's previous runs that are running there. So it's not quite kicked off that deployment template yet. While I'm waiting, I might have a look and check if there's any questions here. So I've got a question here that says, what's the difference between Octopus Deploy and ARM templates from Azure? So yeah, Octopus Deploy is a tool that allows you to actually deploy out things. ARM templates are more for deploying out your infrastructure. So Octopus Deploy can actually deploy out your software, your code, so your .NET, your Java applications, any of that kind of thing. ARM templates are more around your infrastructure deployment. Now, unfortunately, my deployment has actually failed. This is part of the problem of doing live demos. Let's see what's happening here. I think because my deployment name is the same as one I did earlier, it's not actually ran. So that's a bit disappointing, unfortunately. So let me try. Let's see if we can run this in production. And run it for the production environment. Unfortunately, this is what happens when you do live demos. So let's run that in the background, and while that's running, hopefully it'll run successfully this time and not give me any errors and make me out to be a liar. But what we'll do is we'll go back in and have a look at more complex Bicep templates as well. So if we have a look here, you'll see in my folder structure, I have a template called octopetshop.bicep. And in here, I have, again, a bunch of parameters, and I have then declaring a bunch of modules this time to actually deploy out a bunch of resources. What this is actually doing is taking into account and building on a bunch of Bicep templates that I already have. So I've got a template for a web app here, which will deploy an Azure web app out. Again, we've got parameters and we've got that resource deployment. It's saying that we're deploying out that app service to Azure. We're using website name, location, and the app service plan name as well. We've also got a template for my SQL server, so deploying out a SQL server. And this is much more involved deployment as well. This is a much more complex deployment in terms of we're deploying the Azure SQL server, we're also deploying the database, we're then configuring transparent data encryption for that database, and we're also configuring our firewall rules for that SQL Server as well. So there's a lot inside of that template. And creating those templates are great. They take a lot of work, but you want to be able to reuse them. That's what we're doing here inside a more complex and a nested template for Azure Bicep. We've also got the app service plan. So if you're trying to deploy an Azure app out into Azure, you also need to have an app service plan to try and determine how much resources and what type it is, whether it's a Windows one, whether it's a Linux one, etc. So you need an app service plan, a web, and then your web app. This is a template I built for a demo that I do in other times when I'm talking about Octopus, and it deploys out 3 web apps, an app service plan, and my SQL database all in one template. So this is where we're starting to reuse that information that we've learned. So let's have a look at the main template. So we've got all the parameters that we need for all of the resources for the app service plan, the web apps, the 3 web apps that we're wanting to deploy, our SQL Server database, and our firewall rules as well. So those are all the parameters that we need to input into this template in order for it to deploy out. Now, the first section is my app service plan. Again, eagle-eyed will notice that it's actually calling a module this time. We're not calling a resource. We're calling this module and we're referencing the folder where my app service plan template is and calling that template file here. We're not calling the Microsoft API for the ARM deployment. We're actually calling out here the Bicep template in another folder on my machine. And we're just, again, calling out the parameters and saying, the parameters you've been put into from this template, put into this module, and then deploy the app service based on those parameters. We then start to deploy an app service. So we're starting to deploy our web app here. And again, we're calling that module and we're calling that web app template here. We've got it set so that it has its own variable for its name. And then if we scroll down, we're deploying another web app. We're just exactly kind of copying and pasting what we had above here, but we're calling it a different name. So it will deploy with a different name than the first one. So we've deployed 2 web apps on top of our app service plan. And then we've got a third one because we need a third one for this deployment. So we're repeating those modules. We're reusing that template. We're even reusing the code. The code is identical except for what we're going to call it, what parameter we're going to call the name of this web app. And you'll also notice here, we've got a small section that says depends on. So we are dependent on that app service plan module deploying first. So that's basically telling the Bicep template to deploy the app service plan module first. And if it doesn't exist, we can actually deploy the web app afterwards because that has to come first. So it's basically saying deploy that module and make sure that module is first because we depend on this before we can deploy our web app. And then the last resource on this list is actually my SQL Server. So I'm deploying my SQL Server and configuring all of that. And again, that's quite a lot of information. If we have a look at the visualizer tool inside Visual Studio Code, this actually starts to give us a good idea of what that template does. And let me see if I can close that down and give you a better view. So we're taking that Bicep template and starting to visualize it in a way that maybe some other people will be able to disseminate better. Some people love to read code and can quite easily see what's happening. Other people love that visual graphic, and I'm someone that loves a visual graphic. It helps me explain what's going on. We have the ability to figure out what that complex tool, what that complex template, that nested template, calling different resources, calling different module templates into actually does here. And we can see quite easily, if you're familiar with the Azure icons, we've got an app service plan, we've got those 3 web apps that are dependent upon that app service plan. And then over here, we have our SQL Server, our database, we have our firewall rules, and we have our transparent encryption rule as well. Once you start to get into more complex tools and templates, and you start to build them up, you'll start to get more of a picture here. But this visualizer is pretty intense and pretty cool feature to have within it. I think one of the asks from the product team or from the customers to the product team, is to actually convert this into something you could put into Visio, or you can be able to pull this and use it inside another kind of tool where you can do infrastructure diagrams, and you can take this and you don't have to sit there and make make your own. But it's pretty cool to be able to, if you were to share a template with someone else, or you have to grab a template online and try and use that, you've got this visualizer that can give you that instant feedback without having to sit through and read every line of the code and try and understand what's going on. You get an instant visualization of what's happening. So that's pretty cool as well. Now, in order to deploy that template, we have a lot of information that we need to put into that. I think there's about 8 or 9 variables to actually put into that template and run it. So if we, let me just change directory here. If we have a look at the PowerShell command, it's the same start off as the other PowerShell commands. We've got new Azure resource group deployment. We're giving the deployment name. We're also starting to call the resource group. And then, sorry, that's the wrong one, hang on. So yeah, we've got the PowerShell command here, too many pre-built commands here. We've got the PowerShell command, we're deploying it here. We've got the template file here. And then we start to declare all of those inputs. And I think there's about 8 or 9 inputs that we need to put in. So we've got the plan name, the SKU type, the names of the web apps, and last but not least, some of the firewall rules. So if we run that, and it takes, I think, about 10 or 15 minutes for that to deploy. So we might not see it complete for the end of the presentation, but that will kick off in the background and start to deploy within Azure. And we'll be able to start to see some of the progress inside the Azure portal once it actually kicks off. So let me switch over to our Azure portal and have a look and see if it has deployed. I think it's starting, yeah. So it's starting to build up that job here. So we called the deployment job Octo Pet Shop. If we click on that, we can start to see it's actually starting to build up the various different jobs that it needs to do inside that template. So it's going to deploy a SQL Server for us. It's recognised that it needs to do an app service plan. And if we refresh it, then it's starting to pick up the other things. So it's starting to do the 3 web apps that we needed as well. And you can see here by the tick that it's actually deployed that app service plan first of all, because of the way we built that template up and because we used it depends upon, it started to actually deploy that out for us. So it's doing it in the right order, thankfully. But as I said, it might take 5 or 10 minutes for this to actually kickstart. So we'll leave that running. And what we'll do is we'll pack this up now so that we can use this with Octopus. And again, we are packaging up those files into a zip file so that we can use them inside Octopus, and then we're uploading them into Octopus so that we can then call it inside one of our runbooks to actually use. So let me grab this code. There we go. It started to create that zip file there, and it should be uploading it to our Octopus environment. So if we switch over to our Octopus environment, we can see the Octo Bicep files is there for us. Our zip file is there in our environment for us. Now, as I said, this template needs a bunch of variables inputted to it, or information inputted it to it for deployment. And what I've already done is created that variable set. I've created my admin password, my username, my database name, all the various things that I need to put in for this template to actually deploy out. One thing I want to show you quite quickly is here we have the password, and I can't see that password. I can't interact with it. It's because it's marked as a sensible variable. I can change it. I could change it to something else, but I can't see the existing because it's matched as, if we see, it's matched as a sensitive one. So it's hidden from your view. The system can interact with it, but we can as human beings see it once we've put it in and saved it. Now, what we want to do is create a runbook for that Octo Pet Shop. So if we go head back over to projects and runbook and then head into Octo Pet Shop and click save. We want to start to build up that process, and we're going to do nothing different. Even though the template, the Azure Bicep template is more complex than the storage one, we're not going to do anything different in terms of what our runbook looks like. So we're going to do 2 steps. We're going to click on add a step, and we will find the run an Azure script step, and we'll create our resource group. So create resource group. We'll then go down and Worker pools inside Octopus are a bunch of servers or containers that have tools installed on them that can carry out your tasks for you. If you're familiar with Azure DevOps, it's similar to what they call agents. And if you're using GitHub Actions, it's similar to what you call runners. These are just, like I said, servers sitting in the background that have all the tools you need to carry out tasks. So on my Windows server in the background, I have all the Bicep tooling, I have the Azure tooling, so it can carry out what happens in the background. This itself is probably a 15-minute or 20-minute talk on its own, so please don't worry about this. I'm just picking the one that will help me carry out this job. I scroll down and then I want to pick my Azure subscription, deploy this into, and if we grab some of my pre-built code again, we'll put in here into PowerShell where we want to create a resource group. So again, we're using that Azure CLI command to create a resource group based on some of the variables we've put in. Now we've got that first step. Now we want a second step where we deploy the template. So we want another run Azure script step. So if we click on that, and this time we're going to deploy Bicep Template. And again, I'm picking my Windows servers to help me run this. And I'm clicking my Azure subscription that I want to run this in. Now, again, we're going to put in the source code here for our environment to run it. So it will check, first of all, for the package. So it will look for that zip file. It will extract that zip file and get the Bicep files for us. It will then change directory. It will set the deployment name for us. And then it will actually use that PowerShell command again. So it will take all of the inputs and use the variables that we saw inside our variable library and hopefully deploy this template out for us. The last step inside the step is to make sure that we are referencing the package that we want. So if we click on add and click on the Octo Bicep files, that will click and save that out. Now again, this will take probably about 10 or 15 minutes to run, but let's kick it off and let it run away with us. But that's basically how you can take your Azure Bicep files and run them inside Octopus Deploy and automate that process. You can trigger that, you can kick it off, you can have that repeatable, you can do that multiple times. I've got a couple of Runbooks that spin up lots of demo environments, and I can quickly press a button and let it all do that out ahead of time before my demo session, so that I don't have to do that manually and work through that. So that's the demo portion of the talk over with. So the next stage when you think about infrastructure as code is to actually start to think about your infrastructure as code like you do with your software code. Starting to use a central repository where you can source control and version your infrastructure as code and track what you're doing. There's lots of different things you can do and make changes with your infrastructure as code, slight changes that can have a massive impact into how you deploy them and what's happening in the environment as well. So source controlling it and versioning controlling it will help you as an organization. You'll then maybe want to start to look at doing some lint tests and validation tests before you even get to the deployment stage of deploying your infrastructure as code. Now, we saw some of that happen inside Visual Studio Code where we had wiggly lines and it was starting to suggest what we could have inside the template. You can actually start to build that into your pipeline of deploying your infrastructure as code out as well. So having those linter tests, the validation tests that Azure Bicep is doing. So there's lots of things that you can add onto your infrastructure as code pipeline. Also, potentially after the deployment, you want to do a smoke test where you can have a look at whether the resources are actually there, whether they're up, whether they're ready for code to be deployed to them or being used by your end users. So there's a lot more to your infrastructure as code than what I've necessarily showed you today. And it may seem like a lot of work. However, I think once you get this all in place and you get everything working the right way, then it's a great thing to introduce into your environment. The same way that we have done with software and software code, it just helps to make everything a lot easier, hopefully in the long run for you. Now, I know it's probably been a long 50 minutes, or hopefully it's been a long and enjoyable 50 minutes so far, but just to summarise what we did today, we learnt about Azure Bicep and what it can be used for and how it can help you with deploying your Azure resources. We also then looked at using the Bicep templates, building them locally on our Visual Studio, inside Visual Studio Code, and deploying them with PowerShell. We introduced the concept of Octopus Deploy and using it to automate the actual deployment of your Azure Bicep templates. And then we actually started to deploy and build out a runbook that would deploy your Azure Bicep template as well inside Octopus. So hopefully it's been a fun journey. If you are interested in following along and maybe doing the demos that I've been doing today, please do sign up for an Octopus trial. We have a free trial where you can sign up for 30 days and you can give it a go. I'd be happy to try and answer any questions if you had any around using Octopus, but you can sign up for a free trial. So please do have a go at it. Please do test it out and let us know your feedback. If you do a deployment inside Octopus, the very first deployment you do, you are eligible to get a pack of stickers, and I know everybody loves stickers, so it might be worth having a go and spending a couple of hours with Octopus just to get some fancy, awesome stickers as well. Thank you so much today for your time. I know it's been a lot of information and a lot to throw at you, but hopefully it's been really useful. If you're looking for any of the templates that I used, any of the code that I had today, or even a copy of my slide deck, if you want that, head over to the link on screen and have a look there, and all of the information will be there. And yeah, hopefully that's been really useful to you. I'm not sure if we've got any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, we actually have a question. Let me just stop sharing your screen and I will go over to Slido. I think you answered most of them. It's just one that wasn't covered. The one with another tenant, the last one below.
Okay, so the question is, can you deploy with Octopus to another tenant? I currently ship an Azure CLI script to clients, which creates and updates an Azure resource group. You can actually start to look at using different spaces inside Octopus or multi-tenancy configurations if you're managing different clients. So you could have separate spaces inside Octopus, or you could use the multi-tenancy. There's a couple of ways you could do that actually if you're managing customer environments. I just showed you from a one customer environment type example, but yeah, we can definitely deal with that inside Octopus.